Today I'd like to talk about William Paley's analogical argument from design. I'm Matt McCormick, the Department of Philosophy, California State University, Sacramento. There's my email address, my philosophy course website, and my blog address. One of the most influential and most familiar arguments for the existence of God are design arguments. People still hear these, they feel the pull of these, they're by far the most common, and they've received the most attention philosophically in the last 50 years or so. These arguments identify properties of objects in nature and argue that the only way that they could have occurred, or the best explanation for those properties, is that there was some intelligent planning mind who conceived of and created those things. These arguments are empirical, that is, they cite scientific spatial temporal evidence. They look at the world and cite features and objects that we find out there in nature, and then they try to infer the existence of God, who's a supernatural being, on the basis of those. And they're also inductive arguments. They're not deductive, they're inductive. That is, we're trying to find the best explanation. They don't provide us with any sort of guarantee, but they give us what's thought to be the most probable explanation. So in these arguments we observe the features in nature and natural objects, and then infer the existence of God inductively as the cause for those objects. Now, in general, I'm going to introduce discussions of various biases, mistakes, or errors or fallacies that humans are prone to in the context of lots of these arguments, because in order to think clearly about arguments for and against the existence of God, we need to be cognizant of some of the common errors that we fall into in these discussions as a background. Design arguments attempt to show that God exists on the basis of evidence of purpose in the world, but a problem for us when we're considering these arguments is that humans have a high false positive rate with regard to purpose. That is, we are often prone to find more of it in the world than there actually is. And one way to describe this is to say that humans are promiscuous teleologists. Research shows that we are promiscuous teleologists. We find, interpret, or inject purpose into the world where it isn't, even when phenomena, objects, or things we discover are random or purposeless. We tend to find more of it there than there is. Some of this research comes from Deborah Kellerman, Boston University, who showed recently that people are primed to believe teleological statements even when they know they are false. That is, people project design or intention even when it isn't present. And teleology is the study of purpose, so we'll be using the terms teleology or design interchangeably. So Kellerman shows that children will readily agree with teleological statements like rocks are jagged so that animals can scratch themselves. But it turns out that adults, even when they know the natural explanations, and even when they're not particularly religious, they will agree more readily with claims like the earth has an ozone layer in order to protect it from UV rays. It's the idea that the earth was intended for life that's particularly compelling, and it's this notion in the sentence above that says that it has an ozone layer in order to protect it from UV rays. So sometimes the language can be very subtle. It can be slip bias when we don't realize it. We're wired to search out and believe in purposeful explanations. It feels to us like everything happens for a reason, including this misspelled tattoo. Alright, so we need to be sensitive about teleological language. Teleology, as I've said, is the study of purpose. Design arguments are also called teleological arguments. Teleological language is subtly but importantly different from a mere statement of the facts. Consider these examples. The sun makes light so that plants can photosynthesize. Earthquakes happen because tectonic plates must align, versus plants photosynthesize with the light from the sun. Earthquakes are the result of the movement of tectonic plates. So in the first two examples, there's this suggestion that there's some kind of deliberate planning or intention behind it. In the latter two examples, they're just stated neutrally. The difference can be very subtle, and what happens is that our propensity to find purpose, to find reasons in the world when they're not there, will slip in with this very subtle shift in language. So we have a caution. We should be sensitive about the introduction of design or purposeful language into the argument before it's justified or when it begs the question. The point of design arguments is to get as a result, as a conclusion, we're supposed to get the result that the world has a purpose, or that the best explanation is that someone or some mind designed and built it purposefully. So we can't smuggle in teleological language in the premises and then conclude that there's teleology. The purposefulness has to be the result, not the presumption of the arguments. And we'll find that with Paley here and with lots of other examples, that's one of the problems that these arguments are prone to. Some design arguments are analogical, like Paley's. So in Paley's case, he chooses an analogy between a watchmaker and a watch, and God and natural objects like the eyeball. So in William Paley's Natural Theology, or the Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, that was published in 1802, he chooses this analogy. He likes the eyeball, but he uses lots of other examples. And the idea is that the watch got its features, its structural, designed, orderly, organized features in virtue of the watchmaker's conception, designing, planning, and purpose. And since the eyeball seems to have lots of similar sorts of structural features, then there must be some comparable organizer, designer with intent behind its having those features. So Paley contrasts his watch with a rock on the beach. In the watch, suppose we come across a watch when we're walking on the beach, and we compare it or contrast it to a rock. In the watch, we discover that the parts are formed and adjusted for a purpose. They're there to produce motion. If the parts had been a different shape, size, or order, the machine wouldn't work and it wouldn't fulfill its purpose. It wouldn't function the way it does. Larger mechanisms are divided into groups of smaller mechanisms. All the parts fit together to achieve some greater purpose than their individual functions, that is to tell time. The watch has all of these features only in virtue of having a designer. Now, before he moves on, Paley offers some caveats and details about this watchmaker discussion. And he points out some claims that are interesting and that raise some interesting issues about his argument. We do not need to know the maker of the watch, he says, to be certain that it had one. The mechanism by itself makes the agency clear, which is absolutely right. Nor do we need to be able to create such an object ourselves to understand that it was created. Nor does the machine have to function perfectly in order for us to infer a designer. It could falter or cease to function, but it would still be true and evident that it was designed. Nor would the presence of extraneous parts or absence of seemingly necessary parts deter the conclusion that it was designed. Now, these last two are really interesting qualifications because on the surface they seem to suggest this problem. Maybe if I found a watch that didn't function perfectly, or if it was missing parts, or if it had extraneous parts, I could still infer that it had a designer, but those problems would suggest problems with the designer. Maybe the designer wasn't that intelligent, didn't do a good job of designing it, maybe the thing was poorly conceived, and that all seems like it wouldn't bode well for Paley's inference to the existence of God. But I think probably what Paley had in mind was that he's preparing for the fact that we don't understand the full purpose and the full structure and the full design of all these objects in the external world, not just watches, but in natural objects. But that shouldn't deter us from concluding that there was a designer. Turns out, of course, this will come back and haunt Paley or raise problems, objections to his argument. Okay, one more qualification, another interesting one. Now, recall that this is written in 1802, so this is 57 or so years before Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, but Paley says such a configuration of parts cannot be the result of a natural combination of matter through some internal principle or force. So in 1802, 57 years before Darwin publishes the Origin of Species, this would have made perfect sense to somebody like Paley. Paley's thinking about this idea. He's wondering, well, could nature, could matter, could ignorant, blind, mindless matter itself, through some natural process, conglomerate itself or put itself together or build itself into complicated objects with parts and organization and structure? And the idea in 1802 that it could would be just outrageous. Common sense in 1802 would have said that things can't make them, that nature or matter by itself can't make itself into complicated structural organized objects. So this idea would have made perfect sense to Paley in his day, and it's absolutely clear. We can't really fault Paley for not understanding or not seeing through to what Darwin was going to argue, but interestingly we get a kind of denial here of a Darwinian type explanation. Okay, so as we've already hinted, then the question is, are humans artifacts? We can use the term artifacts to describe watches. A watch is an artifact that's created by a designer. So are humans artifacts? Is the world an artifact? Humans, animals, and other things we find in the universe exhibit the same features that lead us in the case of the watch to conclude that the watch was designed, says Paley. The eye's parts are formed and adjusted together. They fit. If the parts had been a different shape, size, or order, the machine would not work. Larger mechanisms are made of smaller mechanisms. All the parts fit together to achieve some greater purpose than their individual functions. So Paley's arguing then that the very same things we find in the watch, we find that would have led us to conclude that the watch had a designer. We find those things in nature and in natural objects, so we should make an analogous inference. The argument then is, in general, objects in nature that have features X, Y, and Z, and in Paley's case these are order, good fit of parts, parts with specific functions, big machines made of smaller machines, and so on, have those features because a designer had a plan and created that object. The universe, or objects in the universe, has those features. Similar effects have similar causes. Therefore, the universe has a designer with a plan that created it. And we can understand why in 1802 Paley would have felt that this argument was particularly compelling, and we certainly understand why his congregation would have listened to him from the pulpit give this argument, and it would have made perfect sense. But of course the problem is Darwin. Alright, so I'm going to adopt a practice in general of giving reconstructions where we try to be as charitable as possible and understand what the author is arguing, and then and only then will we offer some critical evaluation and consider some of the standard problems or objections. Alright, so Paley writes his book, Natural Theology, in 1802. 57 years later, Darwin, when he publishes The Origin of Species, gives us another story. Natural selection gives us an alternative and better explanation for the appearance of design in nature. Now, what I'm going to say next was probably clear from you from your high school biology class, but let's recap the story. Organisms, we know, vary genetically and physically, and these random but small variations are inherited by their offspring. Organisms produce more offspring than can possibly survive, and in many cases resources are limited. So on average, offspring that vary in ways that give them an advantage in their environment will survive and reproduce more successfully. Therefore, favorable variations accumulate in populations. This process that improves fitness for survival and reproduction is natural selection. Thus, organisms and their complex traits, adaptations, will have the appearance of design or being well suited to their environments and modes of life. So, during the history of life, over the course of billions of years, organisms that aren't well adapted are weeded out. They have a lower chance of reproducing and passing their less adapted genes onto their offspring. So slowly and steadily they get weeded out of gene populations. The ones that would appear to be poorly designed are less likely to survive and have offspring. Adaptations accumulate slowly over this billions of years long process. And the organisms that survive, the ones that make it through this process, end up looking like they were deliberately, carefully designed to succeed at their survival challenges. Now, different organisms will move into different survival niches. So down on the bottom left here, we've got bacteria. They occupy a particular kind of environmental ecological niche. And on the far right at the very bottom, we've got humans. They're so small you can't see them compared to the vast diversity of life. And interestingly, you can see the concentric circles here. Those are mass extinctions. Those are mass extinction events where the particular properties or adaptations or traits that the organisms, many of the organisms alive on Earth at that time, the properties they had weren't particularly well suited to dealing with these sudden change. So the last concentric ring there and over on the far right are the dinosaurs and the great extinction about 65 million years ago. And that, for instance, is what biologists and astronomers and geologists think was this asteroid meteorite impact event off the Yucatan Peninsula that created a massive worldwide global cooling and brought about the extinction of the dinosaurs, and then allowed for the expansion of mammals and ultimately humans in to fill the gap that was left open. So what happens over time is that adaptations accumulate slowly, and the organisms that survive end up looking like they were deliberately, carefully designed to succeed at their survival challenges. But the appearance of design is an illusion, because the other ones that look like they're poorly designed are weeded out. Furthermore, the illusion is amplified by our cognitive bias to be promiscuous teleologists. So natural selection and our innate cognitive glitch, our cognitive bias to be promiscuous teleologists, are doubly working against us here to make teleological arguments, to make design arguments feel right, to make them seem like they work. So Paley gives us this early version, and that probably explains why these arguments still have so much traction. It's not to say that none of these arguments can succeed or none of these are reasonable. Paley's argument, we are seeing, has a number of major problems. There's some modern versions that we'll consider, but what's interesting, and perhaps one of the reasons why design arguments have such a perennial appeal and why they have so much traction in people's minds, is because evolution produced all of these organisms that are very well adapted, and they look to be very well designed, and we're prone to find design far more often in the world than we should. So it's like we're running with a handicap here when we run into this argument. Okay, there's a number of modern discussions that are interesting and relevant, and I'll just throw these out there. Two very influential, very important books in the last 30 or so years are Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, which talks about Paley's argument, design arguments, and evolutionary biology in great detail and great sophistication. It's a very important book and has turned out to be quite influential. And another, even more philosophically sophisticated book is from Daniel Dennett called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Okay, some more problems for Paley's argument and arguments like Paley's. Number two, the analogy is weak. And here's the point. What carpenters, watchmakers, and electrical engineers at Intel do is nothing like what a natural being outside of natural law prior to the existence of any matter would do in creating a universe. So think back to the watches are to watchmakers what the universe is to God analogy. And the point here is that, in fact, there's a profound and important way in which what watchmakers do when they create watches is radically different from what God would do in creating the universe. And here's what we mean. Human designers operate within the context of natural law. They use natural law, like the law of gravitation. They manipulate existing matter into different forms and configurations, and they are made up of matter themselves, and their existence depends upon natural laws. So when somebody at Intel is trying to build a new computer chip, he or she is using the periodic table of elements. They're using the elements that are available, silicon, in order to create a computer chip. and they depend upon physical laws, natural laws, chemistry to do what it does so that they can manipulate already existing matter into different shapes, different forms, and configurations to create things. A carpenter takes wood from the lumber yard and turns it into a house. But there's something, but that sort, and the carpenter himself is made of wood and uses tools to do that. But now think about what it would be like for a supernatural creator, if there were one, to create. A supernatural creator, one like God, would have the power to instantiate any set of physical laws. He could make the speed of light faster or slower. He could have made Planck's constant larger or smaller, the number of electrons in the second shell of atoms greater. He could have made PV not equal to nRT, and so on. Furthermore, this being would have created ex nihilo. The universe would have been empty, it would have been void, and then through some act, this being would bring it about that there is matter from nothing, or at least as the standard theological picture goes in Western theism, God starts from nothing and then creates and brings into being matter rather than manipulating or rearranging matter the way human creators do. This being would be above physical laws and have no limits in knowledge and power. A divine act of creation would be utterly foreign from every instance of design and creation we have ever had any experience of. So there's a really profound disanalogy here. By invoking watchmakers and carpenters and computer scientists or electrical engineers, we're saying that there's an analogy between what humans do when they create and what God does when God creates. But look, we're trying to get the result, we're trying to get the conclusion that God exists, and God is so vastly unlike humans that there's this powerful problem, this serious objection to arguments like Paley's. All right, one more question, one more problem, and I'm going to call this the gap. What Hume's objections reveal, and we're going to talk about David Hume's objections in just a minute, is that there's a confusion in many design arguments, including perhaps in Paley's, between necessary and sufficient conditions. And here's what I mean. A necessary condition for some state of affairs is a condition that must obtain, but by itself it might not be enough. So a necessary condition of being the U.S. president is that the candidate must be an American citizen. But that's not sufficient because, after all, Miley Cyrus is an American citizen. It's not merely enough to be an American citizen to be president. A sufficient condition for some state of affairs will guarantee that the outcome will result. So winning a $100 million lottery jackpot is sufficient to make you rich, but it's not necessary because you can do it on the stock market or through inheritance or through real estate or some other way. There's lots of ways to become rich. So it's not, winning the lottery is not sufficient. The challenge with design arguments for the existence of God is that while being omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect seem to be sufficient to create an orderly universe, it's often not established that they're necessary. And here's what I mean. Here's us in the natural world considering this design argument, like Paley's. In general, objects with order, organization, complicated parts, etc. were designed by an intelligent creator. Objects in the universe have those properties. Therefore, those objects were designed by an intelligent creator. And we're trying to use this empirical, inductive information from the natural world to draw an inference and make a leap into the supernatural world. So, what might be justified by a design argument? What, at a minimum, what would be sufficient to satisfy the conclusion in 3? Well, the minimum here that might be sufficient to satisfy the condition in 3 is that some force or forces of unknown power, possibly natural or supernatural, possibly conscious or possibly not, with indeterminate knowledge and moral properties, appears to have been responsible for the creation of the universe. Now that's a far cry from the sort of God that Paley's arguing for, or the God that millions of Americans believe in. That is, we're considering this notion that there might be an omni-God, or the omni-God of Christianity. The Christian God is the almighty, all-knowing, morally perfect creator of the universe who sent Jesus to humans for moral and spiritual salvation. And the idea is that that being exists. And we also know that 4 in 10 Americans are young earth creationists. So even beyond just the basic Christian tenets, they believe that the universe, the earth, and all life were created in their more or less present form approximately 10,000 years ago. So we should call this problem is the gap. That is, a design argument will get you maybe, if we're charitable, if we're generous, a design argument will get you over the line into the supernatural world to perhaps some kind of designing force. But it doesn't get you all the way to the top of the scale. It doesn't get you to necessarily get you to all of the classic properties of the God of theism. It doesn't get us to the omni-God. We might imagine that a design argument advocate could argue that the design of an infinite universe would require infinite power and perhaps knowledge, although we have seen some reasons above to doubt that. But one resounding problem with the design arguments is that they don't establish that infinite goodness or moral perfection is a necessary condition for creating the world that we find ourselves in. More on that issue when we get to the problem of evil. So the idea here is that the evidence that we find in nature might suggest some designing force or forces. But the question is, how much power, how much knowledge, how much goodness is necessary in order to produce those kinds of natural objects? And the place to look here, as I've suggested, has been to Hume. So now this one we can fault Paley for, because David Hume wrote a book called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion in 1779, which is 23 years before Paley's Natural Theology. Paley should have read as Hume, because Hume asked this question: would an omni-being be able to create a universe? Well, certainly an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God would be capable of creating the universe, but is it necessary? Must we draw that strong conclusion from the evidence we've got? If the order and complexity of nature is all that we have for evidence, does that evidence force the conclusion to an omni-God? And what Hume argued in Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion 23 years before Paley published his argument is that no, a lesser being or beings might have done it. David Hume saw the problem long before Paley gave the argument. Hume wondered, well, maybe it's an idiot God. Maybe God's lacking in knowledge somehow, or lacking in intellectual power. That might explain some of the things we've seen. That might explain the massive accident of an asteroid colliding with the planet and creating a mass extinction of nearly all life on the planet. Or maybe that would explain your appendix, which seems to serve no purpose other than possibly getting inflamed, rupturing, and then killing you. Or your wisdom teeth getting impacted, causing an infection that ultimately would kill you too, unless we have surgical intervention. Consider how many humans, before the advent of modern surgery, consider how many humans in evolutionary history must have gotten impacted wisdom teeth just like you did when you were 17. But since they didn't have a dentist to go in and take those out, that problem just got worse and worse until it killed them. Maybe it was a baby God, maybe a God lacking in power, lacking in knowledge, just messing around and created this universe as a kind of play act. Maybe it was a committee of gods. Maybe the appendix problem, the wisdom teeth problem, was because you've got one divine being working on part of organisms and another divine being working on another part of organisms, and neither one of them are communicating or planning well, and we've got to end up having a conflict. Maybe it was an exhausted God. Maybe this act, of course, and God, according to the standard view, rested on the seventh day. Maybe this universe was all this being could have created. Imagine the difference between a divine being who has the power to create any one of an infinite number of possible universes, or an infinite being who only has enough power to create this particular universe that we're in. Now, most people, I think, would say that the former God has more power than the latter God. So if we're going to attribute omnipotence to God, we'd probably want to say, well, an omnipotent God would be capable of creating any of all the possible universes. Now, we've got this universe that we exist in, And maybe the being that created this one had more power to do more, but the problem is it necessary given the empirical inductive teleological argument we've been offered? And the teleological argument we've been offered just says, well, this universe appears to have a designer. How much power must we attribute to that being? And Hume's point is only a minimal amount of power is justified in order to create this universe. Hume threw out the possibility of an absent-minded God who left his keys behind, and that's us in our universe dealing with our problems now, and now he can't find it. Or maybe it's an absentee God, and this view was actually popular with some of the founding fathers of the American Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and some of the others appear to have been deists, and this idea is that God set up this massive machine with all of its internal working parts and its features, hit the play button, started this thing, and then left it to unfold on its own. And that being perhaps would be lacking in some of the omni properties, or perhaps the explanation for problems like myelocyrus or leukemia is that we're the victims of a cruel God, or maybe even more naturally it was aliens. And here's the premise of Ridley Scott's movie Prometheus. Aliens seeding planet Earth early in its evolutionary history with genetic material that would then go on to spawn life and lead to the evolution of life on Earth. Alright, so in conclusion, we can summarize now. The design argument infers the existence of God from the complex parts and the appearance of careful adjustment in natural objects like the eye. William Paley gives one of the most widely recognized and influential versions of this argument. There are several problems with this type of design argument by analogy. First off, the theory of natural selection shows that life on Earth had no designer. The analogy is weak because of the natural-supernatural carpenter versus supernatural creator problem that I've described. And even if we grant that there was a designer, as Paley has argued, we can't justify the inference to any of the divine properties because design arguments often confuse necessary versus sufficient conditions and fall into what I've called the gap.